Thank you, Maggie. Good to have everyone join us for our virtual program on leadership in the Second World War today. As Maggie said, I'm John Long, the Director of Education here at the National D-Day Memorial. And of course, our education this spring has been through this camera and through your internet connections because, of course, we're closed down, haven't had visitors coming by. We're looking forward to the day when that's going to change soon. But for the moment, we are thrilled to be able to reach out through technology and help to educate people about the importance of the Second World War. And today, of course, speaking of leadership, who were the main leaders of World War II? And more importantly, we're going to start with the question of what qualities made them good leaders or bad leaders, depending on the example we're talking about. We're going to talk about 10 of the most important leaders. Let me say from the outset, there's much more to the subject. There are generals we should be mentioning. We just don't have time to cover everyone. There are other nations that aren't represented here in our discussion, and so much more to the subject. So we're only giving you a starting point today, but hopefully a good starting point for you to start reading some more and doing your own research on what it meant, leadership meant in the Second World War. And to start this discussion, and actually going to finish the discussion with this gentleman here, George C. Marshall. He was Chief of Staff of the United States Army during World War II, and in many ways the architect of victory. We'll get back to him toward the end of the program, but I want to start today with a letter he wrote in March of 1944 to a classroom of students in, of all places, my hometown of Roanoke, Virginia. A teacher in Roanoke by the name of Mrs. Lillian Craig had written to General Marshall, who, remember, he's in the middle of fighting a world war, just, designing the strategies for victory for the World War. And she wrote him this letter from her students asking about this subject of leadership and specifically how he chose generals within the United States Army based on their leadership skills. It's something the students in her class had apparently developed a great interest in as they followed the war. And so they wrote this to Marshall. And you would think, again, in the middle of a Second World War, the most important military advisor to the president in Washington, D.C. might have just sent back a form letter, thank you for writing. I'm too busy to discuss this right now. But instead, he wrote back with a very lengthy letter to answer the students' questions. I think that's very impressive because I think he was probably considering the subject of leadership himself on a daily basis. And in this letter, which is obviously too lengthy for us to read right now, but he described for students the sort of qualities he looked for in choosing generals to help to fight the war. And he said this, probably the most important sentence. He said, quote, "The most important factor of all is character." Okay, we'll probably all agree with that. Character is obviously an important trait in choosing a leader, but that's a little vague. What does he mean by character? What is involved in good character or bad character? So he elaborated with 4 points of what was involved in the character he was looking for in leaders. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. The most important factor of all is character, he said. And then he gave 4 points of what was involved in that. First one being integrity. And didn't define integrity for us, but we'll define it for our purposes as the desire to do the right thing and being compelled to do the right thing in a circumstance. Second one was determination. He called this, quote, unselfish and devoted purpose. So you got to be determined to exhibit good leadership. Third one on his list, we will call confidence. He put it this way, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical. In other words, when everyone is complaining about what you're doing, still being able to stay the course and continue on with confidence. And then the fourth quality he looked for in leadership was selflessness. He called it a willingness to sacrifice self in the interest of the common good. And so integrity, determination, confidence, selflessness, all adding up to the character traits that this most important leader of World War II was looking for. So as we survey these top 10, I call them top 10 leaders of World War II, keep these qualities in mind. Some of these leaders we're going to talk about are good examples for us. If we want to be in a leadership capacity in our school, in our family, ultimately in the community, in the workforce, maybe in the military, these men are going to have qualities we would want to emulate. Others we're going to talk about, they are negative examples. They are teaching us what not to be, how not to act, because some of them, frankly, are some of the greatest villains of the 20th century. But keep these qualities in mind as we look just very briefly at 10 of the leaders of the Second World War and how they exhibited these qualities either in a good measure or in a bad measure. Nonetheless, whether they were good leaders or bad leaders, ones to admire or ones that were just absolutely evil, they certainly made history. And if we're going to say that we are familiar with the history of the Second World War, these are names we need to know. Now, these 10 were picked, incidentally, by the Virginia Department of Education in the Virginia Standards of Learning. I know a lot of you are not in Virginia, and so you may have different lists for your schools, but these are the ones that the state of Virginia identified as leaders that history students in grade schools should know, be able to identify and easily recognize as associated with the Second World War. So we're going to look at these and with, again, the obvious disclaimer that any one of these men we could talk about for hours. Take the 10 men together. There have been thousands of books written on these 10 men. Obviously, we only have a few minutes to talk about any one of them. So bear in mind, if you find one of these guys very interesting, Google them. Check out some books from the library and find out more about them, because there's so much more to any one of these men, much less all 10 of them put together, than we have time to go over. So we're going to start with political leaders of the Allied nations and begin with one of the most important on the list and, of course, one of the most consequential figures in all of American history, and that is, of course, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He was, as I say, one of the most important figures in the American history books, no matter, if you look at World War II or before that. He was president longer than anyone else in the United States history. He was the founder of the New Deal, helping to get the nation through the Great Depression, so much more. But of course, our concentration today is on his leadership in the Second World War. And it's interesting that Roosevelt, even before the United States was forced into World War II by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had already long before recognized the threat of the Axis nations, Germany, Italy, Japan, their threat to the peace of the world, and sort of instinctively understood that eventually the United States is going to have to play a role in defending freedom from the forces of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. He was not a militarist in the sense that he really sought out war and wanted to fight it, but he was certainly a great war leader once that became his role as the commander-in-chief of the United States. And he did an exemplary job in mobilizing the nation to war, in inspiring his people. And interesting to study the relationship between some of these leaders and their militaries. And one thing you would find out is that Roosevelt, unlike some other leaders of the Second World War, he was very quick to listen to his military advisors and not usually to second guess them. He was willing to listen to different opinions and make his own decisions, certainly, but he was not one to try to tell the generals and the admirals how to fight the war. He let them tell him the information that he needed to know. And I say that's different than some of the other leaders that we will talk about later on. Roosevelt did not finish the war. He died in April of 1945 when the war was Still about a month left in Europe and 3 or 4 months left in the Pacific. So he did not live to see the end of what he had led, the war effort that he had led for so many years. But by the time of his death in 1945, he had certainly established the mechanisms for the impending victory. And we'll talk about his successor in just a moment. The other thing that's interesting about Roosevelt, and certainly should always be kept in mind, was, and it was not widely known at the time during the war, but that he led the nation and this Allied war effort while in the confines of a wheelchair. His handicap was hidden largely from the public, but certainly is an important factor for us to remember the obstacles that he had to overcome to exert this great role in world history. And so Roosevelt's first one on the list. Second one was a good friend of his and a very important ally, and arguably the man of the 20th century has been called, and that is, of course, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Historians at the end of the 20th century, looking back at retrospectives and trying to identify who were the most important men of the century, Churchill was often at the very top of the list because of his leadership of Britain and fighting the war longer than Roosevelt did. He was he was a leader of the Allied effort when Britain stood alone and before the United States got into the war. And so it's much to his leadership qualities to be admired and studied. It's forgotten, though, very often by admirers of Churchill how much he was considered before the war not much of a leader, is more of a crank. Is what the British call a backbencher, a man in parliament who really doesn't get to positions of leadership because a lot of people didn't really like him. In the 1920s, he was not entirely lonely, but certainly outspoken voice against the rise of communism. And that bothered some people, how outspoken he was on that subject. And then in the 1930s, he became almost a solitary voice against the rise of fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, warning the British people that this was a threat that could lead us to war and advocating for preparedness. When at the time, a lot of British politicians and the British public, they did not want to think about a war. They wanted to avoid war at all costs. And here was this cranky backbencher, Winston Churchill, saying, we've got to get ready. We've got to build up our military to be able to fight this. Once the war started, he began as at the head of the British Navy, the Lord of the Admiralty, but in 1940 became Prime Minister of Britain, just as British ally France fell to Nazi Germany. And so at that point that he became really the leader of destiny for the British people in World War II. And just exemplifies a lot of these qualities of leadership that we would want to emulate. His eloquence in making speeches and speaking to the people directly through the technology of radio of the day, his tenacity in the fight, determining to fight on to the end. His very persona really became the essence of wartime Britain, and no surprise that he was so widely admired, not only in Britain, but across the globe, and in the decades ever since then. As a war leader, Churchill was not perfect. None of us are. He was more apt than Roosevelt to meddle in the affairs of his military and to tell the generals what to do, sometimes well and sometimes not so well, but he certainly helped to inspire his people to continue working on to victory. He's also a very close friend of Roosevelt. One of his first moves as prime minister was to send messages to Roosevelt and to develop this constant conversation with him about the war, even when the United States was still at peace. And he understood that the United States was going to be a partner in the eventual victory. And so Churchill's another man who is widely admired and interesting case study. Third one on our list, the other of the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and then Stalin, is a leader of an entirely different manner. Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union during World War II, was, well, quite frankly, he was a monster. He was a very little to admire in Stalin's leadership, and even before World War II, he had really secured his leadership of the Soviet Union through terror. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of people, and that was a fact that tended to be overlooked in the war. The Allies, because he was our ally, we tended to kind of gloss over all of the terror that had brought him to power and held him in power. Soviet Union, after all, was a totalitarian regime where the people had no freedoms, where the government was, a great threat to any given citizen. It was a terrible situation, certainly. And Stalin, again, is one of history's worst mass murderers by any stretch of the imagination. Nonetheless, he was important to the subject of the Second World War. He was made a lot of history, to say the least. Many Americans don't really understand well enough how much the Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership contributed to the ultimate Allied victory, simply by the fact that they tied up so much of the German army in the Eastern Front and lost so many soldiers and ordinary civilians as well in this fight, in paying the price for victory. Stalin supposedly said after the war, maybe this is attributed to him as something he actually said, but it's often it's a formula to explain the Allies. He said that the British paid for the war in time because they fought Hitler longer than anyone else. The United States paid for the war in dollars because our industrial capacity made victory possible. But he said the Soviet Union paid for the war in blood, and this is true. They lost maybe up to 20 million people in World War II, but helped to make victory possible. So if you want to look at the big three, two of them we can admire greatly. One of them we need to understand and we need to study, but he's certainly not much admirable to Joseph Stalin by any stretch of the imagination. Last of the Allied leaders I should mention is Harry Truman, who becomes the president of the United States in 1945 upon Roosevelt's death. And Truman is also widely admired, kind of forgotten that in 1945, a lot of people said when he became president, who's this guy? He'd only been vice president under Franklin Roosevelt for a few months when Roosevelt died, and he was not well known beforehand. And even his most friendly biographers have to concede that when he became president, he was really not well prepared for the job. He had very little concrete knowledge of the war effort at that point, and yet he had the character of leadership that we are talking about today, that Marshall spoke of when he wrote that letter to the class in Roanoke. He had that integrity, that discipline, that selflessness, and the willingness to do what needed to be done to continue moving on to victory. He grew into the job and became, again, a widely admired figure. A lot of people thought no one could ever replace Roosevelt. And of course, no one ever could replace Roosevelt, but Truman certainly did a great job in leadership during the war. Probably his most significant and difficult decision came at the end of the war in the Pacific, when he was the one who made the call to drop atomic bombs on Japan as a way to end the war. That is a very debated subject, of course. Many people, you get some historians who claim it was the proper decision and absolutely necessary. Others who say it was a terrible decision that resulted in the deaths of so many hundreds of thousands. And that's an interesting subject for you to read up on, read both sides of the story, and come to your conclusions. but it was certainly decisive leadership, whether you agree with it or not. Truman made the decision and he stuck by it. And say he has supporters and detractors, but everyone could look at him and say this was certainly a man who made history through his decisiveness and his leadership. Okay, so those are the Allied leaders, political leaders. Let's go to the other side, the Axis, and look at their leaders. And here again, not much to admire here. We'll begin, of course, with the other man on our list who was an absolute monster, and that was the leader of Nazi Germany, a name that everyone knows and associates with the Second World War, Adolf Hitler, one of the most malevolent leaders in all of history. Hitler was born in Austria, interestingly. Now, a lot of people don't realize that. He wasn't even born in Germany. He was born in Austria, and initially grew up hoping to become an artist. Frankly, he wasn't that talented, and so that avenue closed for him very quickly. He sort of floated in adulthood from job to job until the First World War broke out, and then he enlisted in the German army, although he was Austrian, and actually proved to be a fairly competent soldier. After World War I, he, for various mechanisms we don't have time to talk about, he became attached with a small political party in Germany that eventually takes the name the National Socialist Party or the Nazi Party. And Hitler soon rose to become its leader. Now, what does the Nazi Party want in Germany under Hitler's leadership? It wants absolute control over Germany, absolute power in Germany to begin with, and then to begin to exert their power over the rest of Europe and ultimately as much of the rest of the world as they can. Again, don't have time to go into a lot of the politics of how Nazism worked, but of course the main thing we need to remember about Nazism is that it was virulently racist, virulently anti-Semitic, leading ultimately to the Holocaust, the near extermination of the Jewish people in Europe. Hitler was a leader, to be sure, but he was not a leader that we can admire. He also held power like Stalin through terror and through a police state that controlled the lives of the individuals. And of course, by his drive to expand Germany, led the world into this worst war of all of history. So again, by the definition that George Marshall gave us in that letter to the school, he is not a leader that we want to admire. He may have had, he may have had the ability to make decisions and force them on his people, but he certainly lacked the integrity, the selflessness. Much like Stalin, he is a man that we cannot admire, but we do need to understand his place in history. Next on our list was the leader of Japan for much of the war effort, Hideki Tojo, Tojo Hideki, in Japanese, usually done that way, but usually in English, Hideki Tojo, the prime minister of Imperial Japan for much of the war and a important leader even before he became prime minister. Also had some decisive leadership qualities, certainly, but once again, not a particularly admirable man. He knew a good deal about military science. He had a background in the military, and you can argue his military leadership was effective to a certain point. However, he also helped to get Japan into this war that nearly destroyed it. He was one of the leading advocates for the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the war and ultimately began this process by which Japan would be nearly destroyed. And also he presided over a nation that was responsible for the starvation of civilians, the torture of many Chinese people in the war against China, the horrendous treatment of prisoners of war in the Pacific theater. All these things are, again, part of his legacy, and once again, not the sort of leadership we want to admire, but the type of leadership we need to understand historically to know how this war happened and how it was carried out. Tojo, at the end of the war, was captured, put on trial for war crimes, and ultimately hanged in 1948 for his part in fighting the World War. So Tojo is an important figure, certainly not a greatly admirable one. He was actually, though, not ultimately in charge of Japan. That job went to the emperor, whose name in World War II was Emperor Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan. Now, one thing to understand about the Japanese war effort and the role of the emperor is that the emperor in the Japanese system back then was considered to be almost divine, almost a god. He was more than just a mortal. He was certainly not an elected leader. He inherited the job as part of his, just place of birth. But he was also considered by the Japanese people to be this infallible, godlike leader. And yet, despite that, Hirohito during the war really did not make many of the decisions for Japan. He really didn't yield much authority. Or wield much authority, rather. He yielded that authority to the military leaders for most of it. And so he was certainly aware of how Japan was fighting the war when they decided to attack here or expand there. But he was really following the advice of his military leaders for much of the war without exerting his own desires and his own decisions on the military until the very end. And this is where Hirohito becomes such an interesting case study in decisive leadership, because at the very end of the war, he exerts on the military his most important decision, which was that we need to stop. We need to surrender. By August of 1945, Japan had been absolutely decimated, lost so many millions of people, and then their cities have been laid waste by bombing campaigns. And then in August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japanese cities. And even at that point, some of his military wanted to fight on. Hirohito, though, could see that this would lead only to more death, more destruction, more bloodshed. And so he ordered his military to surrender in 1945. And that was a decisive leadership. And as I say, historically, probably the most important decision he ever made. It saved, I don't know how many lives by ending the war at that point. It meant that we would not have to invade Japan at the end to end the war. And this was certainly an important decision on the part of Hirohito. He's also the longest lived of all of these leaders we're talking about. I was actually in college when he died. I remember when he came across the news that Emperor Hirohito had died. He became, after the war, a man whose leadership, again, was very important in helping to rebuild Japan, switching it from this imperial system to more of a constitutional democracy. And so, again, interesting case study in leadership, both good and bad, and how he grew over time in his role. So Hirohito is an interesting one to look up and read some more. So those are the Axis leaders. There are others in there, Mussolini in Italy, for instance. We don't have time to talk about everyone. But let's go on now to the military leaders of the Allies and talk about some of the generals, beginning with, the one that's most relevant to the National D-Day Memorial, and that is Dwight David Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander for the European Theater for the Allies, and the one who was the leader of the D-Day invasion in 1944. Eisenhower makes another interesting case study of leadership. Go back to those 4 qualities that Marshall gave: his integrity, determination, confidence, selflessness, and he exemplified them in a remarkable degree. He was a very impressive leader. You can make the argument he wasn't the greatest military battlefield leader on the list. He never led men in battle during his military career. He was more in an office than on the battlefield. But nonetheless, he had qualities that some of these other military leaders didn't. One was the ability to put together a coalition and hold it together. And that was an important quality in this type of coalition war that we're fighting. He held the alliance together through the European theater in ways that probably no other general possibly could. And he deserves to be remembered for that. That quality of leadership and keeping together all these different forces and getting them moving in the right direction, that's something that not only wins World War II in Europe for us, also eventually lands him in the White House as he becomes president in the 1950s. And so Eisenhower was certainly an important leader. Makes an interesting comparison to a friend of his, at one time his commanding officer, and that was Douglas MacArthur, the top American general in the Pacific theater. Different kind of leadership. Much to be admired about MacArthur, yeah, much to be questioned, because of nothing else about MacArthur. One thing, if you read about him, you'll quickly discern he had an enormous ego. He was very egotistic, but at the same time also very militarily competent. And that's true of a lot of leaders, incidentally, that their egos tend to be very large. If their competence goes along with it, then that's good. But often there is a lot of ego involved in leadership. And MacArthur exemplified that. He was a man who certainly thought a lot of himself, loved to get attention in public relations and newspapers, glowing newspaper stories about him. He became a hero for the American people at home, largely because he did seek so much publicity. But if that's something, we don't usually admire people who just want to get their pictures taken over and over again. But he had a lot of military talent to back that up. And his leadership of the effort to win back the Pacific and defeat the Japanese became very important in World War II. He also was a great, very important leader in the Korean War afterwards. And we don't have time to go into all of that, but he certainly deserves more attention than we have time to give him, but an interesting leader, in many ways an interesting contrast to Eisenhower. And then final one we want to come back to is where we started, and that is George C. Marshall. Pretty much everyone has heard of Eisenhower. Probably the vast majority of people, even if they're not particularly history buffs, they've heard of MacArthur. Unfortunately, not nearly enough people know who George C. Marshall is, why he was important, and why he deserves a lot more attention than he gets in our historic memory. He was a career military leader, as I said earlier, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, not too far from where we're standing right now, and rose up through the ranks to ultimately the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, which on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so in other words, the head of the military, in essence, under the Commander-in-Chief. He took his orders from Roosevelt. However, beyond Roosevelt, pretty much he was in charge. And he was a man who could figure out what needs to be done and how it needed to be done, as well as put the right people in place. Remember that letter he wrote to the class in Roanoke was about how he chose generals like Marshall, like MacArthur, and put them in charge of their area of the war. Marshall was the commander of all these, right? So Eisenhower and MacArthur both answered to this guy, and yet not nearly enough people know who he is or why he was important. He wrote the letter about the leadership of others. I don't think he was thinking of himself when he wrote that letter to Miss Craig's class, but look at those four qualities: integrity, determination, confidence, selflessness, and he exemplifies them for us. Not only is he the architect of victory in World War II, helping to secure our freedom, helping to make sure that the good guys won in this war, but after the war, his leadership in a political role as he becomes Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, becomes the architect of NATO, the military alliance after the war, puts together the Marshall Plan that helps to rebuild Europe. All these are absolutely essential roles that he plays in history, and it is really a shame that not nearly enough people know about George C. Marshall. Historians obviously know about him, can talk about him. Books have been written about him. But the average person on the street, if you ask them about the generals of World War II, they'll say, oh, yeah, Eisenhower, MacArthur. They'll bring up Patton and some of the others. But Marshall too often gets left off the list because he was one of the most decisive leaders of the 20th century. If you want to study the subject of leadership, he's a good place to start and look at him. Was he a perfect leader? Not really. He made some bad decisions here and there. He was also, one historian called him terrifying to his underlings, and that's not always a good quality necessarily, but he certainly was a leader that made a difference in the Second World War. So there we have it, 10 men who fought the war, and some of them we can admire and emulate, some of them we don't want to copy at all. We want to remember as monsters and use them, if anything, as a negative example of how not to behave or lead our lives. Historians are going to forever argue about the role of these men, who was more important, which decision was a good one or a bad one. But all historians are going to agree that these 10 men made history and deserve to be remembered. It's not an exhaustive list, of course, but it is an important one. And as I say, the one that's the 10 men who are defined by the Virginia Standards of Learning as ones we should know. We're going to understand the Second World War. So these 10 men made history, and we are still living in their shadow because of it. Okay, I'm going to hold it there with that quick survey. And if we have any questions, you can send them over to Maggie, and she's nodding to me. So
which country did Hitler take over first in his effort to take over Europe?
It depends on what you mean by takeover. First territorial expansion was into Austria, his home country, in the Anschluss of 1938, when they annexed Austria to make it part of Nazi Germany. First one he really took over in a military, he took over Czechoslovakia after that, but the first one, a real military effort, was with Poland in 1939, and that's what's usually considered the start of the war in Europe. By the way, we talk about the start of the war in 1939 when Hitler invaded Europe. In China, and there's another man on the list we could, or some leaders in China we could put on the list as well, Chiang Kai-shek, for instance. But in China, they were fighting World War II since 1937, and fighting against Tojo's Japan. Okay, any other questions?
We do. So a question, well, it was a statement, but why was Mussolini not mentioned, and could you talk about him just a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Mussolini, it was not mentioned simply because it wasn't on the list of the Virginia Standards of Learning. Not that it's not important, but you just can't always cover everything in a high school history class. Mussolini was the head of Italy, fascist Italy. He became the leader of Italy in 1922, 10 years before Hitler. Incidentally, he was the senior partner in that alliance. Fascism, I can't go into a lot of political discussion of it. With the time we have, the fascism was a lot like Nazism. It was certainly a totalitarian regime, and Mussolini was very militaristic in the sense of wanting to take over other countries. And so no surprise, he becomes an ally with Nazi Germany, with Imperial Japan, the Axis, as it was called. Mussolini, again, not a leader we want to admire, but one we certainly should understand.
So did China fight the good fight, or did they get crushed?
Interesting question. Did they fight the good fight? Well, really what was happening in China, in a nutshell, is 1937, China was invaded by Japan, and who's fighting against the Japanese in China, really two factions. The nationalists, and the United States usually supported them, fighting against the Japanese, but there were also the communist faction in China fighting against the Japanese. And they are the ones that ultimately went out for control of China afterwards. They were an ally. And that's something else that not nearly enough people understand, is that China was one of our allies. We name the allies, we think of Britain, we think of France, we think of Canada, we think of the Soviet Union. but China is often left off the list as well. But they did a very important job. Were they crushed? Well, they were, parts of it were taken over by the Japanese and held. Ultimately, though, since China is one of the allies, they're on the winning side. And then there's a whole civil war after that, again, subject for another day.
So was the policy of appeasement something that you think would have affected the leaders that you've listed in regards to their character? And
very interesting. Appeasement was the policy in the 1930s, especially the British, the French, to allow Hitler to make demands and seize them without stopping him. In other words, we don't want to go to war over something like the annexation of Austria, the annexation of parts of Czechoslovakia, and ultimately all of Czechoslovakia. So we will appease him. We're going to allow him to take this. It's sort of like when you're you got a 2-year-old brother or sister and he's screaming for a cookie. What's the easiest thing to do? Is give him a cookie, right? That's appeasement. And so the leaders of prior to World War II, who were appeasers, they don't make this list. They're usually looked at, that's usually looked at as a failure of leadership rather than a quality we want to admire. Churchill was one of the leading voices against appeasement in the 1930s and leading up to World War II. And so appeasement, again, you can make an argument, that'd be a whole other subject. Was it a good decision? Was it an understandable decision? Was it a bad one? Did it cause the war? Did it try to prevent the war? You know, we could go on to a lot of debate about appeasement itself, but ultimately it certainly didn't stop World War II from happening. In that sense, was a failure. Churchill was the one who said this is a mistake. We can't do this. And he goes down in history as the great leader of Britain.
So let's see, we got quite a few ones. Let me try to pick some.
I'm afraid we won't get to all the questions, I imagine.
Let's see. No.
You're welcome, by the way. If we don't get to your question, you can email it to education@dday.org, and we'll try to send you a reply.
Did any of the countries switch sides?
Did any of the countries switch sides? Interesting question. Italy actually did. Italy, under Mussolini, was on the German side. 1943, we invaded Sicily, part of Italy, and then Italy itself. And along the way, the Mussolini was actually overthrown briefly, and Italy came in on the side of the Allies. Later, the Germans sort of reinstated Mussolini, and some Italians kept fighting against the alliance. But Italy, interestingly enough, really did switch sides officially.
Let's see.
And by the way, one of the great examples of leadership also that we go into for a lot more discussion is the fact that at the end of the war, our enemies become really good friends. That's one of the great successes of World War II that's often overlooked. Japan was our enemy in World War II. Now they're really good friends. They're really good allies, great trading partners. Germany, same thing. Italy, same thing. And that's one of the great successes of World War II as well, how we turned enemies into friends in the post-war situation.
This is an interesting question. So would you say that this was the death of nationalism? And are we seeing a resurgence in nationalism today?
It certainly wasn't the death of nationalism. In fact, World War II inflamed nationalism in a lot of places as nations that previously were part of empires began to push for their independence, like India. So no, this was not a death of nationalism per se. We're seeing a resurgence, yeah, in places, certainly so. And this nationalism, of course, is a desire of a people to govern themselves. And so after World War II, you see a lot of nations trying to create, in fact, most of the nations that exist in the world really come after World War II. Okay, well, I think we're about out of time. Let me point out some other programs coming up, though, before I forget. On Thursday, the 14th, we'll have a lunchbox lecture on pop culture in the 1940s. That'll be an interesting one for us. On May 18th, we'll look ahead to Memorial Day with a program on what is Memorial Day. on May 21st, a talk on the turning points of World War II, especially 3 battles in 1942 that really brought victory out of defeat. June 1st, a program on propaganda posters of World War II. That's going to be a cool one. And then on June 11th, another aspect of the war that's often forgotten is the CBI, the China, Burma, India Theater. And we'll have a program on June 11th on the fighting of World War II in China, Burma, and India. So join us for all of those. You can find more information on our webpage, dday.org. And again, if we didn't get to your questions, we apologize. Just had a lot of them. Email them to us, and we'll try to get you an answer. So thanks for joining us. And again, we've only scratched the surface. So get some books, check out some web pages, and learn more about these figures and what happened during the Second World War. So thank you very much.